We are from the great river that feeds our souls and our children, and it gives us pride to know that you guys are here sharing this with us. It's very nice for me to be welcoming you people to my territory because, one, I've traveled many roads to your territory, and I always felt humbled to say, wow, what a great crowd, what a great bunch of people to be with, my people. So I'm very proud here today to say welcome to Sedunsis, welcome to Willistic Way territory, and on behalf of my community and the Chief and Council, I wish you many memories to be made here. I hope that you take advantage of all the activities that our committee, our planning committee, as well as the AFN committee has planned for you for this next 2 days. So on behalf of myself, I'd like to say, Walewan, thank you. And to the elders, thank you very much for your thoughts, your prayers, your good thoughts to make us very humbled to be here today. So Walewan, Balalan, merci beaucoup. Walewan. Thank you very much. I see Chief Hill at microphone 2. Let's take a comment here before we move to our next welcoming. Microphone 2, please. Microphone 2, please. Tom, microphone 2, please. Well, the light's on.
Hello? Sego.
Voila.
Thank you to the people from New Brunswick for welcoming us to your beautiful territory. It's good to be back here in the Maritimes. But I feel a little uncomfortable with people being turned away at the door if they've got black lanyards on and being put in a theater. I think they should be allowed back in here. There seems to be a lot of space in the back. When we got notice, we were told that, chiefs and delegates should be in here, that no one would be turned away until the room was full. Well, the room isn't full. She mentioned traveling many miles and to come and visit us, and I've got counselors and advisors with me, and I think that they should be in here as well. And when you look around, you can put your cameras in the back. There's a lot of empty seats. So, and I don't think we should be turning our people away from entrance into this room to hear us. And this is a chief's meeting, and as a chief, that's what I'd like to see.
Thank you very much, Chief. I'm apprised by the AFN that that's being dealt with now, and so I believe we are going to make the room available. And we're just going to be conscientious and remember that if in fact we get to that part where we're overflowing this room, I'm not prepared to put myself or the co-chairs or any of you at risk for health and safety reasons relative to our building. And so we may need to do some adjustment as we go through the day, but we will pay close attention to that. I also note before we move to our next welcoming speaker that the Chief for St. Mary's has approached microphone 1, and so please, microphone 1, please.
Will responsible. Ladies and gentlemen, chiefs, I want to personally, on behalf of the New Brunswick Chiefs, I want to personally welcome you to Wabanaki territory. Peace and friendship is what we come together to stand here with one another, to ensure that all of our voices of our Indigenous people are being heard. I stand in front of you today, ladies and gentlemen, with pride because I'm so proud of the people of the Willistic Way territory. The youth that you witnessed to the drum, our beautiful elder that shared the language today, and of course, all the members of my council. We come together to ensure that all the delegation, including the chiefs, have a wonderful experience. Our purpose is to ensure that you go back to your territories and have a piece of Woolstock with you. And I'm sure by the end of the few days of this gathering, you will. I personally want to invite you to my sunset ceremony, to the sunset celebration tonight. It's a social. It's a celebration of LGBTQ2S. I am the proud, two-spirited chief here in this territory, and I carry that very well. So I invite you tonight, lots of rainbows at the Delta Hotel tonight, so be my guest. Enjoy your time here, and we'll leave it.
Congrats, Chief. Thank you for that. I look to our regional chief, Roger Augustine to bring welcoming remarks on behalf of the region for the Assembly of First Nations. So, Regional Chief Augustine.
So, ladies and gentlemen, before I start off with my opening and welcoming statement, I want to ask you a special favor and start practicing and pretend you're on your way back to the airport and say, what an amazing, amazing 40th anniversary for the AFN. And I want you to rehearse this too as well. The chiefs of New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island have to be the most amazing chiefs in Canada. And once you get that down path, I want you to say, I really like Roger Augustine. So, a little bit of honesty, a little bit of everything else sometimes is not healthy to say, but I want you to know, and Chief Hill, where are you? She never fails to provoke. And I remember one day, she was upset, and she was exactly where she is, like right now practically, and she turned her back and says, I'm not talking to the executive, I'm talking to the chiefs. I had my phone with me, and I text her. I said, Chief, you still look good, even if your back is turned to me. Welcome to our territory, Chief, and welcome to all of you. You're going to have a great time. The Willistook First Nations people and our chiefs and councillors too as well. I think a lot of times we have a tendency to, not to mention councillors. They are the source of power and energy for our chiefs, and great council leaders produce great chiefs. So with that, have a great time, and I'll be seeing you at different parties the next few days, and you're going to have so much fun here. And we might even do some business while you have some spare time. So may God bless you, and thank you for joining us here today, and thank you for being so kind. And believe it or not, you look absolutely great from this angle. Thank you very much. Bye.
Merci, Chef Régional.
Thank you, Regional Chief. Right now, I would like to invite you to join your voices to mine to welcome the First Nation National Assembly Chief, Mr. Perry Velga.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Kakia no tintik no akumagnak mista ne naskamon. Kakia kipeyak ogimawak. Napeyak skoyak oskayak oasak. Kakia ken naskom tenoa. Mista pikskin hionam sisi. Ogimaw peesio oase segasio. Koska tea maskusessa skonigen otsinia. No taminans manatul ken naskomten. Wolostokik peoples can naskumtinoa nista. Tapa miasen. A little bit in Cree, just to say I'm happy to be here, friends and relatives, acknowledging the chiefs that are here, the elders, the men, the women, the youth, acknowledging the Wolostokik peoples for the welcome here to the unceded territories. They're beautiful, beautiful lands. To my colleagues on the executive, greetings. To all the guests and relatives here, I say a big thank you. We see the premier is here. We see the minister is here. We see the mayor. You could say Fredericton's probably a thriving suburb of St. Mary's. Yes. We're always starting to say that now. Just in utter recognition of how we're building a better territory together and how we share the land and resource wealth together. What a big honor to bring greetings here. And I thank the chief and council from this territory. I thank Regional Chief Roger. I also want to acknowledge some very special people this morning and thank them and lift them up for what happened, not only here in the Grand Entry, but aside across the river. And of course, we always lead with good ceremony, and we acknowledge people, because when I look around the crowd, I also see the federal crown here, Minister Bennett. So I usually think over here, and then, oh, there she is. So I'm acknowledging all the other MPs. It's good to see you all. I want to, again, just from our Assembly of First Nations, acknowledge what happened in ceremony this morning. And I always begin that way, because that ceremony really is what lifts us up and guides us as Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples. And across the water, and I also want to thank, we canoed across that river this morning in birch bark canoes. And what an experience that was. Because Roger's a terrible paddler. I had to do all the lifting. But the experience of being in a birch bark canoe and the water was so calm. It was so peaceful. And it was reminded of that ceremony, that water ceremony that happened, that pipe ceremony that happened, and to acknowledge and thank the elders that prayed. And it reminded each and every one of us of how we're part of that creation in our worldview. And we all know what that is, how we give thanks. We acknowledge Creator. We acknowledge the ones that sit in the east, in the south, the west, the north. We acknowledged the four-legged relatives, the ones that swim, the ones that fly, the ones that crawl. Acknowledged the male plants, the female plants. We acknowledged our relatives, grandfather, sun, grandmother, moon, and our relatives in the sky, the beautiful spirits, the stars, and beyond. We acknowledged as well, those grandmothers look after the waters, the rainwater, the fresh water, the salt water, and the importance of that water ceremony to give us life. And so I wanted to begin by acknowledging and thanking those male elders, those female elders, that reminded us that we're the two-legged tribe of peoples. We don't care if you're white people, black people, yellow people, red people, or polka dot. We're the two-leggeds. And we're part of that worldview. And we have to live together as part of that worldview in creating good space for our little ones. And I wanted to begin that way, to remember that we're all in this together, no matter what we do, no matter what we think about, no matter what we're trying to do. Put our worldview first. Put those ceremonies first. They will guide us in what we do. I also wanted to acknowledge some very, very special people, these little ones that come in. And what a big honor, no matter where you go, to see the little ones that come in. But what they did for all of us, earlier on they sang an honor song at the back. And you could see that pride. You could see that in them. You could see that attachment to ceremony. And I wanted to really thank that school, the Chief Harold Sapier Memorial Elementary School singers, those young ones, for reminding us the importance of ceremony, the importance that we're going to move beyond that residential school system now. And we're going to bring that pride back in our languages, in our ceremonies, in our traditions. And they reminded us of that in a very special way. So for me, to those little ones, I want to applaud you and salute you for that really good work and that strong welcoming that you did for us this morning, for coming in and leading us in a very special way. To the drum group here as well. And we have many nations and tribes across Canada. Many nations and tribes. Many. And I've said this before. There's much diversity. But there is one thing that does bind us. And it's the drum. Drum songs, ceremonies, drums. And we acknowledge the singers for that Beautiful song, the grand entry song, the flag song, the victory song, and it's that drum. It's that heartbeat of Mother Earth. It beats in all of us. So I acknowledge and lift them up in a good way, a special way. So now, colleagues and friends, why are we here? Why are we together? What are we focusing on? What are we trying to get done? And the theme of this one, celebrating success, looking back, maintaining momentum, moving forward. One of the points that we always talk about is going to be something that's very special, because years ago, back in 1986, 16 chiefs and councils back home at the Touchwood File Hill Scapel, I got elected as their assistant tribal council rep back in 1986. And I took on that role, strong in my resolve to improve the lives of our people. And I got the same passion, the same desire, and the same commitment now as I did then to continue to bring about and effect change. The change we all want and need in our lives, in our First Nations, and our people's lives. So in 2015, we took many of those things we identified by chiefs over the years, and we wrote the Closing the Gap document to influence the federal government election. We wanted to influence the federal party election platforms. And guess what? We influenced them, no question. And it wasn't a small impact. It was a big impact on how the government worked with us. It's not enough, but it has become a more serious and a more effective conversation, focusing on outcomes and on permanent changes. We have yet to close the big gap I keep talking about, that socioeconomic gap that exists for our people. But we have started on some very important changes. And we know there's more work to do. Yes, we've seen the boil water advisories on reserve go down from over 130 down to 57. Good movement, positive movement. But yet today, the people of Attawapiskat and Ibumatong can't drink the water, can't bathe in the water. Still a water crisis. And we take that fundamental human right to access clean water for granted. And so we need to do more. There's no question. The young people and the old people and the men and the women of Attawapiskat and Ibumatong, there's 50 more First Nations can't use their water. So it's something that we all have to focus on and remember. Let's not take that for granted. Tie that in back into that water ceremony. Water gives life. So that absence of safe drinking water and decent sanitation and infrastructure, it impedes the good life that our people have the right to enjoy. So that absence of water infrastructure means that poverty will continue. Socioeconomic developments will be slowed down and economies are stilted. So we have more work to do. We have a lot of work to do. So our Assembly of First Nations is working. They're working to repeal that Safe Drinking Water Act of First Nations Act. We're trying to look at legislation developed with First Nation. It's essential to meet the real needs of our people. And we do want our people to be better off. So we've said, we've got to make water a priority. Let's get it done and deal with it once and for all. And that's something that we've got to focus on. Water is a fundamental human right. And it is moving in the right direction, no question. But we have more work to do. It's one point I wanted to highlight here. I also wanted to say, chiefs, that as we look towards what we've done in the past, I think about some of the developments, and one big thing, Bill C-92. I'm going to highlight some of the recent milestones. Because yes, we want to celebrate and celebrate things that we've achieved. And we know that things aren't perfect with C-92, but it's movement. And we looked at C-92 and we talked about the importance of focusing on prevention, not apprehension. We talked about focusing on First Nations jurisdiction and keeping children, our children back home with their families in safe, caring, loving homes, not ripped away from their parents or their guardians. We still have 40,000 children in provincial care. And we know that's not acceptable. And we always said this line that we have more children in care now than at the height of the residential school. And we know that's not acceptable. So we say, what are we going to do about it? How do we exert First Nations jurisdiction, creating our own laws, our own First Nations Child and Family Services Act, based on our language and our culture and our ceremonies to keep our children home? C-92 was passed. We're going to build upon that work. We've got to persevere. And I've said it this way, that no one here can look into the eyes of a child in care, one of the tens of thousands of our children in care, and tell them that things are okay the way they are. We're not going to do that. It's time for change. And that's why we focused on Bill C-92. It's about building our own child care systems, implementing our own legislation on child welfare, and where this is happening, that Act supports that. It's not going to affect existing child welfare agreements. It focuses on prevention, not apprehension, no question. And it says that First Nations jurisdiction is paramount. It's paramount over provincial and federal laws. And that's something, and I'm glad Premier Higgins is here, because at the Council of the Federation meeting at Big River, I reminded the premiers of that there's another jurisdiction to recognize in Canada. It's not just federal government jurisdiction, provincial government jurisdiction. There is First Nation government jurisdiction, and that's got to be respected now going forward. And that's what we got to keep moving forward now. It's not just 2 levels of government, there's more levels of government. And that's why that law is so important. But we've got to work together. We have to work together on C-92. I want to acknowledge, and I rarely do it, but I have to acknowledge the good work of Chief Kevin Hart, Mary Ellen Chappell. They helped drive this. Where's Chief Kevin? There he is. I want to lift him up, portfolio holder, but he's taken a lot of hits. That's what we say. We take a lot of hits from everybody sometimes. But we know it's part of that service. Part of it being an Oskape, our servant, our helper of the people. Mary Ellen Trappel Lafon, very smart lady, helped drive this. People on the NAC, the NAC, thank you. People on the Legislative Working Group, thank you. Very important work. I do want to say on the C-92 how tricky it was. How tricky it was getting it through the Senate. Man, that was a challenge. It was difficult. Changes, amendments, gains by different groups of senators, whether they be conservative, liberal, independent, my goodness. But it happened. It happened. And so now we have an opportunity to bring about change. And yes, we dealt with the on-reserve discrimination through the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that showed that on-reserve don't have access to the same programs and services for children. Moving ahead with that. C-92 deals with those 40,000 children in care. That's what it's attempting to do. And so now that it's passed, we still have to move on in terms of working for implementation of that act. And I did encourage the premiers to set up those bilateral processes, province by province by province, working with First Nations chiefs to work out jurisdiction discussions. How will this look? How will this work? How will we respect jurisdiction of First Nations peoples over their children? So that work is going on in some territories. I look at BC, it's already going on. I look at Saskatchewan, some tribal councils, Saskatoon, it's going on. But others have to be involved as well. So we have work to do in that front. I also want to say now from C-92, we did attend the Council of the Federation meeting, and history was made. So Chief Bruce Morin, the councillors at Big River First Nation, hosted the premiers of Canada. First time ever coming out to the res, or coming out to our First Nations lands and territories. Coming out to listen, watch, and learn something about First Nations culture. Sharing and growing. It wasn't yet at the big table yet. And I mentioned to people, well, why is the AFN there now? You're not at the main table yet on Wednesday and Thursday, Chief Bellegarde. Why are you there on the Tuesday? And I said for 3 reasons. Number 1 reason, our Cree law, Wahkot Doin. That's my family up in Big River. Chief Moran, the Drevers, they're my family. They adopted. We're family. So how would it look if the family didn't show up to support something going on in the community? So that was one reason. My relatives were there. Second reason, Bill C-92 was passed. So we needed to engage in the dialogue with the premiers because this was the only issue that they committed that they would deal with and focus on, child welfare. So for those reasons, we attended. And there were other things that we raised. Quick report in 2 sentences here about what did we raise. In addition to C-92, things we talked about, and we encouraged the premiers to, number 1, create a bilateral process in each of your provinces and territories with your respective chiefs so they have access. Because you still continue to make policy and legislation and rules and regulations that impact on rights and title and jurisdiction, but create the space for dialogue, to talk about how we share the land and resources, to talk about how you'll respect our jurisdiction, to create the bilats. So that's one ask. We also asked, change curriculums in the provinces. Look at curriculum changes. Teach about treaties and inherent rights. Teach about the impact of the residential schools. Teach about the Indian Act so that children K to 12 learn about these things because they're not taught adequately. So we made that request. And then there was something very special that happened too. What I noticed, that some premiers are saying, you know what? We're making investments on reserve too. $500 million in British Columbia for housing. Premier Horgan. $50 million in Indigenous language in BC. Premier Horgan. There were some investments in Ontario as well at one point for on reserve. So what my point was, in Saskatchewan as well, the Premier made investments in education training institutes on reserve. So what I'm saying, Chiefs, remember historically when it used to be, province can't put any money on reserves because that's a federal government jurisdiction. What we're starting to see is that wall break down. There's more investments now from provincial governments on reserve for education and housing and infrastructure and water. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. And so that happened. So things were starting to change. Things were starting to move through dialogue. So that was a powerful thing. Very powerful thing to witness, to see that happen. We have much work to do as well with the provinces as well, because I left them all a letter. And one of the points I asked was for a policy change as well when it comes to licensing and permitting. Because when institutions or organizations or corporations or entities come to provinces to develop the natural resources, whether it be timber, water, potash, oil, coal, uranium, whatever it is, they usually go to a provincial government for a license or permit to go and take resources, and develop resources. And I said, maybe think of a policy change. That until First Nations start issuing their own licenses and permits under their jurisdiction, until that is recognized as legitimate in terms of our ancestral lands and territories, maybe make it a policy change that before you do that, that you ensure that that company has a very, very clear strategy on procurement, representative workforce strategy, employment, and even revenue sharing. And if they don't, do not give them a license or permit. I said, that policy change will facilitate, that will facilitate a lot of partnerships. Because their chief said, we're tired of seeing all these resources with nothing coming back. So we put that down. So the importance of working with the provinces for policy and legislative change. So we dropped all those seeds. We're going to hope they germinate going forward. The other one now, education. We lift up our Chiefs Committee on Education. A lot of good things happening in education. And we know the gap I keep talking about now, it's 12 Canadas up here. We're down at 72 yet. How do you get out of poverty? It's good education. And yes, it's kindergarten to grade 12, math and science, literacy and numeracy, on to university, technical vocational skills training. Equally important, our elders tell us, your language, your ceremony, your traditions, and your customs, and who you are, and our children walk in both worlds now. We need two systems. And so now we see that gap in education being closed, because at one time it was $6,500 per child for on-reserve schools, yet in provincial schools it was up 12, 13,000. French school system almost 20,000. So through the investments, that gap is closed. I talked to some of the BC chiefs. How much you got now? 23,000 per child in BC. Yeah, that's awesome. It's closing now. So that education gap is closed. Finally investing in children. Fastest growing segment of Canada's population. It makes sense. That gap's closed. So I lift up the Chiefs Committee on Education and all the work there. It's a way out of poverty, no question. But we always say walk in balance. Two systems of education our old people tell us, our young people need. And so there's still a lot of work to do. But there is movement. I also want to say as well now, the other bill, C-91, language, the language bill. Again, the importance of language as identity. The importance of language when we start talking about nationhood. The importance of language when we start talking about ceremony and how it connects us to the land and the water, and how we need our language in our ceremonies, in our worldview. And we've said it this way, that now our language is so important to our identity. We will no longer be ashamed to speak Cree, our Mohawk, our Dene, our Coselis, our Mi'kmaq, our Maliseet. We will no longer be ashamed. We're going to walk in pride. We're going to lift our heads up high. And that's the importance of language. And we say it this way, we do not want that residential school system to win. And governments have an obligation to expend just as much resources to revitalize and rejuvenate and bring back our languages as much as they spent to try to eradicate them. And that's what we're pushing forward with C-91. That's identity, that's nationhood, that's sovereignty, and that's jurisdiction. So C-91, it is even in Section 35. And people say, why are we putting our sacred languages in someone else's bill? Statutory funding. Reference to Section 35 is in there. Powerful statement. It's not perfect. But this is all about nationhood. And it makes people think the importance of language and identity. C-68, the Fisheries Act. Lots of things going on there. That act creates space for the recognition of rights, respect cooperation with First Nations, and we try to say that First Nations now are in a better position to manage resources. Yes, there was a co-management agreement signed. Chief Dalton Silver called me a couple weeks back. I don't know if Chief Dalton's here. But he said, you know, Chief, we finally got that co-management of salmon on the Fraser River signed with DFO. There was happiness. It was good. Finally, after 20-some years. Got it going. Powerful thing. Co-management of that resource. Then the slide came. The slide came. And First Nations under our jurisdiction, they said, we're not going to fish because of the slide. But yet the external ones would say, yeah, sports fishermen, go ahead. Some commercial fishermen, go ahead. So there was no respect for that jurisdiction again. So on one hand, we want to say, lift up the fisheries minister and co-management of that resource. Yeah, well, respect that. Because we see what's going on there. And then as well, here in this territory, the snow crab issue. And the not respecting what the Supreme Court said in the Marshall decision. Moderate livelihood. Make a living. Our treaties were all about mutually benefiting from the land and the resource wealth. We weren't meant to be poor in our own homelands. We weren't meant to be excluded from the resource. And so when our fisher people are trying to exercise their inherent right, treaty right to fish, we can manage that resource. Moderate livelihood. So on one hand, we have these co-management of resources with the feds. Good stuff. Then respect that spirit and intent. Respect First Nations law and jurisdiction. We want to manage that resource because that resource gives life to everyone. So again, one hand, yeah, lift up. But then we give examples of where there's no respect for that First Nations jurisdiction, even no respect for the implementation of the martial decision here in this territory. We've got to fix that. And it's only by working together we can fix that, to bring about that respect for rights, title, and jurisdiction in those treaties we have. I also want to say, chiefs, on the international front, some movement now. And what I'm referring to, some people call it NAFTA 2, the CUSMA, Canada, United States, Mexico Agreement, still has to be ratified and implemented. And I was asked from the Prime Minister's office, I believe, and Privy Council, Chief, would you sit on the advisory committee to Chrystia Freeland as they start negotiating and renegotiating the NAFTA 2 agreement? And so I scurried around to the executive. Hey, executive, what do you think? Went to our Chiefs Committee on Economic Development. What do you guys think? Should I participate? Participate. And that was a couple of years ago. And so we moved on that front. And so right away I asked for, if you're renegotiating NAFTA, include an Indigenous Peoples chapter in NAFTA, especially in light of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People being ratified by all the countries of the world. Sure, there should be a reference to the UN Declaration as our roadmap to reconciliation. So include an Indigenous Peoples chapter in NAFTA. So there was 4 new chapters that they tried to get in. Gender chapter, environment chapter, labor chapter, Indigenous Peoples chapter. And we argued with business people, why is that going to be part of business? Why is that part of trade? Because it creates economic stability and economic certainty. It creates that space for recognition of rights and title. It creates that space for dialogue, but respect. If you want a stable economy, you want a stable environment, good, ripe for investment, then you use that UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a roadmap to reconciliation. At the end of the day, didn't get the full chapter for Indigenous peoples within that. But when you read it, it has now become by far the most progressive international trade agreement as it relates to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' rights. There's an exception clause for our rights. There's the investor state dispute resolution mechanism that's going to be gone in 3 years. There's support for Indigenous women entrepreneurs. There's an economic council, so there's movement on the international front. And so now that agreement becomes the benchmark for other agreements. And so we have much work to do, building upon international trade agreements. And eventually we'll get to the Jay Treaty. We didn't create these borders. We didn't create the Canada-USA border. We didn't create provincial territorial borders. We didn't do that. It's Turtle Island. We have ancestral lands, ancestral territories. And we have to find ways to make sure that our rights, title, jurisdiction are respected, to make sure that we're part of the, not only national economy, but internationally. So these international trade agreements really become a focus on that international front. I also want to say as well, and I lift up the Tanaka Nation, Siwapik Nation, Okanagan Nation, the Columbia River Treaty process. There was exclusion for a while, right? Weren't at the table. So we had to kind of open the door for those nations to go in. So we've done that. We've opened, now you sit there. Finally. And that's a good thing. We need your voices to be strong. We need your help, guide, to learn from what's going on there. And so I lift you all up and thank you for that, for going through that door. Because that's going to have an impact as well, because water is going to be such a precious resource. Water. People are going to be fighting over water. And now we need to use our traditional knowledge to safeguard that, protect that, based on our teachings. It's a living entity. It gives life. And so I wanted to acknowledge that process going forward and how we can listen and learn from that. We also lobbied and advocated for things to slow things down. Thank you, Minister Bennett. What I'm talking about, the rights recognition framework. Halted, slowed down and do it right, is what the Chief said. First Nations-led process. We all want to move beyond the Indian Act. These ones got to lead it. They've got to drive it. Not us. We can create a framework, but they've got to lead it. First Nations-led processes to move beyond the Indian Act. Exerting your jurisdiction, reconstituting yourselves as nations. That work has to go on. And that's tied into fixing those 4 policies. Comprehensive claims, specific claims, additions to reserve, and the inherent right to self-government. And there's a table process to fix those now. So I acknowledge you and lift you up for listening and for working with us. We have much work to do yet. I want to say on that one as well, there is a piece of legislation that had much support from across Canada. A piece of legislation that was supported here in this Assembly by all the parties in the House of Commons. Unanimous support. But it didn't get passed. Much support. And that's Bill C-262, Private Member's Bill, to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There was much support for that piece of legislation. It was a private member's bill. And again, the power of the Senate, I'll say it that way, because procedural wrangling, and Chiefs, if you follow the legislative process from start to finish, that Senate becomes key. And learning how to maneuver, how to work things. There's procedures, there's tactics. You can slow it down. You can't bring it to a vote. You'll refer it to committee. Then there's ongoing amendments. Then it goes back from the Senate to the House of Commons, and the House of Commons back to the Senate. It's a very laborious process. And it is sad because some of the games played by certain senators that never allowed that piece of legislation to come to a vote. So it died. But there is hope. Because we have an October election coming. And so now what do we make as one of the number 1 issues for the Liberal Party, the NDP Party, Conservative Party, the Greens? If elected, we would like you to say, as part of your party platform, that you will bring back C-262 under a government bill and not a private member's bill. And that's the roadmap to reconciliation. Once that passes, the UN Declaration is the minimum standards internationally for the rights of Indigenous peoples. And that's how we're going to do it now. And so that's hope in a sense. 3 months is not a long time. So I wanted to mention that. 262 didn't quite make it. But we do lift up Romeo Saganash for his hard work. Bringing it that far, so close. We can't leave that dream. And nation states have passed it. But there is an obligation now to give it legal effect in nation states. Federally, even provincially. One of the calls to action from the 94 TRC calls to action. Provincial government BC. I gotta say, usually we lift up good leadership, eh? And I didn't have the chance to blanket Premier Horgan in front of the other premiers, kind of like a little competition. He's doing good stuff over there. And so the challenge, Premier Higgs, you got to keep up with that guy over there doing that. Just a little humor. Because that shows leadership. That's what BC's doing. What's happening in Saskatchewan? What's happening in New Brunswick? What's happening in Manitoba? What's happening in Ontario? What's happening in La Belle Province de Quebec? Still important for premiers to start looking at legislation. So it's varied across the province. But going forward to the next election, that there be a government bill to find a way. And use 262 as something to build upon and make it better and stronger. And that's one of the items going forward. I also want to say now, Chief, a few more points. The 21.4 billion. That's what I have on my notes. That gap's 12 versus 72. 21.4 billion over 7 fiscal years. Unprecedented investments for First Nations issues. Unprecedented investments. I say that's 4 Kelowna Accords. 4 Kelowna Accords. And we look at it and we look at all those things from the $1.3 billion in loan forgiveness in BC and Yukon and NWT for the loan forgiveness for some of the self-government negotiations. We look at the $1.2 billion over 5 years in education and closing that tuition gap. We look at the $600 million for housing, and we always say, yeah, there is progress, but progress doesn't mean parity. You're finally starting to see it come out. Because every year I go, Chiefs, are you seeing any of these investments? Most of you see, no, not yet, Chief Bellegarde, not yet. But now Chiefs are saying, we're finally starting to see it. We're feeling that impact now. And that's the responses I'm getting from Chiefs. We're finally seeing it in education. We're finally seeing Jordan's principle being honored and implemented. And even the back pay for all those things the First Nations themselves have invested. So getting that back into the hands for children. So it's starting to move. But there's still more work to do when we start talking about long-term sustainable, predictable funding. And I lift up the Chiefs that are on this fiscal committee, this new fiscal table, Chiefs, because we know contribution agreements don't work. And so now this committee is working toward a new relationship with the Crown, a new fiscal relationship with the Crown that's based on a number of things. Number one, it should be based on your total membership. It should be based on needs, treaty-based funding, keep up with inflation, and a percentage of land and resources, GDP. Because we're sharing a lot of land and resources with everybody in this country now called Canada. So that new fiscal relationship with the Crown is so fundamental to nationhood, to sovereignty, jurisdiction, in meeting the needs of our people. So we're going to keep building on that front in terms of fiscal. I want to say as well now, Chiefs, from that front, federal elections coming, October 21. What's going to happen? When is the writ going to drop? Priorities going forward. And I've said it this way. And we are working on a Closing the Gap 2 document, because that document will be used to influence all party platforms. We want to see these items, priorities, as part of the party platform in the Liberals and the Conservatives, the NDP and the Greens. It's our job to influence that. And so we've said, you know, going forward into October, one of the main things we've all got to deal with and focus on is climate change. Our elders said climate destruction. We see the big winds, we see the floods, we see the fires, we see all these natural things that are turning around, and our elders predicted that. Mother Earth is saying something. She's saying, stop it. Stop that hurt, stop the pain, stop the pollution. Stop it. So climate destruction. We've all got to work together. We all have to move forward on moving faster off our dependency from fossil fuels to clean energy technologies. And I look, Chief Gord Planis at Souk, solar, all solar at Souk First Nation, wow. Henvey Inlet, big wind towers going on. There's movement. We have to do more. And so that's one of the things. Even talking about climate change and dealing with the Paris Accord, we have to make sure that this Earth doesn't warm by 1.5 degrees, or else we're all done. We have to focus on that. When it comes to Paris and the Climate Change Accord a few years back, first time ever again in an international agreement that there was reference to Indigenous peoples and elders' traditional knowledge. And I do lift up Catherine McKenna as the Minister of Environment. But as well, you know, behind the scenes who was lobbying? This goes back a few years, and I rarely do this, but I got to lift up this young Mohawk man. Because behind the scenes in Paris, he was doing a lot of lobbying with the minister's office. And Mr. Will David, I don't know where he is, but because of Will David, you've got that preamble stuff in the Climate Change Accord. That's the kind of advocacy work and the lobbying that has to happen, and that's our job to make sure we're referencing all these things. And I just lift him up. I don't know where he is, but Will, good job on that. Because I was there and I witnessed that, all the work, and everybody thinks, oh, we're going to Paris, big trip. It's constant lobbying from night to day. Start in the morning to the end of the day. So that Paris climate change, big thing. The number 2 element, restorative justice. All we have to do is mention Colton Bushy, John Stiers. All we have to do is look at the jails, and we see them full of our people. And we never call it a court of, it's a court of law. It's not justice. And so we have to look at restorative justice. We have to look at making sure that there's not only common law and civil law recognized in Canada, but there's another code of law, First Nations law, First Nations jurisdiction, Creators law, natural law that has to be respected as well. And Canada is a country, there must be room for that to happen. And that's what we've got to start doing when we start talking about restorative justice. You would not have the RCMP going in with the Wet'suwet'en law prevails. It's what I talk about, exerting laws, occupy the field. That's what we mean, in addition to common law and civil law, that law, First Nations law, has to be recognized and respected. That ties in as well. One of the points I keep talking about is getting more and more First Nations people into decision-making tables and authorities, getting more and more First Nations people around key institutions that make decisions that affect our people and affect our rights and title and jurisdiction. And one of those things I'm talking about, wouldn't it be nice one day to look at and see the first First Nations person appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada? Wouldn't that be nice to see and something to push for as part of restorative justice? And yes, it's more First Nations Crown prosecutors, more First Nations, the whole system, but that's tinkering with the system. We've got to look at our own laws, our own court systems as well. Seeing policing as an essential service. All those are part of a justice system. Even the coroner reports. Kind of the lead-in to the importance of the missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls, calls to justice, and the need for full implementation of that very, very important piece of work. Developing that national action plan, working with us to make sure that the families aren't forgotten and put to the side, making sure that the families have space, have voice, making sure that they have room to heal and share as well, suggestions to make the system better. And so now, from climate change to restorative justice to implementing the MMIW calls to justice. Moving beyond the Indian Act, the 4 policies, we've talked about that as a priority moving forward. Fixing those 4 policies are based on termination of rights and title, not recognition. I've talked about the new fiscal relationship with the Crown that's so necessary. And so with that federal government election coming, I want to say now the importance of voting. The importance of influencing all party platforms, no question. And once we see what each party has in terms of Indigenous or First Nations priorities, make an informed choice. You know, when we look back to 2015, there was a fire lit across Canada. 61.5% of eligible voters, First Nations voters, voted. In some instances, they ran out of ballots on reservations because so many voters turned out to vote. And so now the message is that First Nations priorities are Canada's priorities. First Nations issues are Canada's issues. And if you want to become Prime Minister or a Member of Parliament, you better listen to our people and our issues, concerns, because we vote now and we are important and we have impact. That's what's going to happen in October. We're not going to be pushed to the side anymore. And we've embraced that concept of dual citizenship. We've embraced that concept of dual citizenship. Part of the Cree Nation, part of Little Black Bear. And if you want to exercise that right to vote, do so. We've all done that. That will bring about impact in October. I also want to say now, concluding, today is a day when I stand with you and look back and say, we worked on that together. All these things from that act respecting youth and families, Bill C-92, all the investments and new approaches in education, some progress has been made, but not nearly enough on the clean water that we need. Looking at the Indigenous Languages Act, very important work. And that's important because this is the International Year of Indigenous Languages within the UN. And now we have to do more because we want a decade. We need to work with Canada to push for a decade of Indigenous languages. So we're not put to the side after a year, not forgotten that all countries of the world will recognize Indigenous peoples as founding languages. Decade for Indigenous languages around the world. And now we say how we move forward is we're going to push all governments in Canada to continue to work with us to make gains. And to Canada, to the people of Canada that are watching, we always say, continue to walk this road with us. Continue to build a better country with us. Embrace reconciliation. Make lasting change. Make lasting change that will matter to the next 7 generations. Chiefs, we've worked together these past few years, and we brought positive change. And now we must continue to lead and bring an agenda to whomever forms the next government so that the next 4 years will build upon the gains we've made. We've seen how much we can accomplish when we stand together for our children, for our families, for our rights, for our nations. We have more work to do and more milestones to come. So with that, in the spirit of all we've been taught by those who have gone before us, let's begin our assembly. Ego se, que nascum tenoa.
Thank you very much, National Chief. The Regional Chief for New Brunswick has also asked that we acknowledge that the Fredericton Chief of Police, Roger Brown, is also present, so welcome, sir. And as we turn to our next welcoming speaker, I wanted to note as he makes his way forward that when he took office in November of 2018, he became the first New Brunswick Premier from the city of St. John. He also has the distinction of having grown up in one of the smallest, if not the smallest, communities in New Brunswick, and he's in a community called Forest City, which at last count, its full-time resident population was 7. So please help me welcome the Honorable Brian Higgins.
Good morning. It's certainly a pleasure to be here, and that's a hard act to follow with Chief Bellegarde. It's what a passion, what an opportunity to be here with him today and here with the Assembly, and welcome to New Brunswick. And yes, New Brunswick's about a lot of things, and small town New Brunswick is one of them, because many people in our great province have grown up and moved on in different areas, because rural New Brunswick is changing as we know it. So, good morning once again. Bonjour and thank you for having me. C'est un plaisir d'être ici ce matin. We, the province of New Brunswick, recognize and respect that New Brunswick comprises part of the traditional territories of the Wolastoqey, the Mi'kmaq, and the Passamaquoddy peoples. It is a privilege to be here with you in Fredericton on the traditional territory of the Wolastoqey. I want to thank Regional Chief Augustine for inviting me to speak and to be part of the grand entry. It is truly an honor. I also want to welcome National Chief Bellegarde and those visiting our beautiful province. I hope all of you enjoy your stay and have the opportunity to do some sightseeing while you are here. J'espère que vous appréciez votre séjour et que vous aurez l'occasion de faire quelques visites touristiques. As the Premier of New Brunswick, I want to reconfirm this government's commitment to build and strengthen relationships with the Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and the Wolastoqey people so that we can work toward the betterment of our province as a whole. In New Brunswick, we are all treaty people, and while we have taken many positive steps in our relationship, we still have a lot of work to do. Au Nouveau-Brunswick, nous sommes tous visés par être traités. Nous devons faire plusieurs pas dans les bonnes directions pour améliorer nos relations, mais il reste encore beaucoup de travail à accomplir pour faire progresser la réconciliation. When I took office, one of the first things I did was make Aboriginal Affairs a standalone department with a minister dedicated solely to this portfolio. One of the main priorities of the department is to increase awareness and understanding of the treaty relationship between the Crown and First Nations. I am proud of the work Minister Stewart has done on behalf of this government to move reconciliation forward and to strengthen the relationships we have with all three nations in New Brunswick. In keeping with the spirit of the peace and friendship treaties, and with this government's vision of a strong and sustainable economy for New Brunswick, it is important that we work in partnership with First Nations with the purpose of creating economic well-being for everyone. We are committed to consulting with First Nations, and we want First Nations to be part of the solution to the problems our province is facing. We also need a clear understanding of just what consultation means to ensure that we've done it effectively. Il est important de travailler avec les Premières Nations afin d'assurer le bien-être économique de tout le monde. It's time for open, honest, and meaningful dialogue that will achieve substantive and fair results as we move toward reconciliation and fulfillment of the treaty promises. We will build a stronger New Brunswick by working together. Nous allons bâtir un New Brunswick plus fort en travaillant ensemble. Thank you. Merci. Wuliwan, Wulalalan.
Thank you very much, Premier. I would now like to call up the Honorable Jake Stewart, Minister of Indigenous Relations for the province of New Brunswick.
Elders, National Chief Perry Bellegarde, Regional Chief Roger Augustine, Regional Chiefs, New Brunswick Chiefs, dignitaries, and guests. I want to echo the Premier's words in thanking you for inviting me to speak today. I also want to welcome National Chief Bellegarde and all the chiefs and delegates who are attending this annual general meeting. I wish you all a very enjoyable stay, and I'm proud to be here on the traditional territory of the Wolastoqey people. I am so incredibly proud of Chief Alan Polchis Jr. and the organizing committee for the work and effort that has gone in hosting the AFN's annual General Assembly on this traditional territory of the Wolastoqey. Congratulations, Chief, and Maliwan, for bringing this event to New Brunswick. This event will not only bring economic growth to your community, but also to New Brunswick. And that's really it, isn't it? When First Nations communities in New Brunswick can thrive, the surrounding areas will also thrive. Look no further than Sedansisk, St. Mary's, thriving community right in the city of Fredericton, traditional Wolastoqey territory. I think that New Brunswick's economy will prosper as far as First Nations communities can thrive. I think there's a direct relationship between that. I'm also honored to be standing here today as the province's first minister of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, and I wanted to tell you what a privilege it is for the learning experience that I've undertaken since November. I was in December into Ottawa for AFN meetings. I was in New York City for the international delegation for the United Nations. And I was also in Gatineau to receive the bundle on the stage with other dignitaries. It's growing up in New Brunswick, we didn't learn history, full scope of our history. Later studied at St. Thomas University, and that's where I got a better understanding of Canadian history. So I think that the past 9 or 10 months has been one of the greatest learning experiences that I've ever had, and I feel it's a great privilege. The relationship that I've been trying to build with First Nations is important to me not only as a minister, but on a personal level as well. My father's great-great-grandmother is Mi'kmaq from Nova Scotia, so I know that I am somehow, I believe, 5th generation, so it's down a long way, but I've always known that I have some genealogy with First Nations, and I'm quite proud of that, and it's with the Mi'kmaq peoples. My parents taught me at a young age the importance of being respectful to First Nations. Since becoming minister, I've built upon this knowledge and have made many connections by asking questions and learning more about First Nations identity. One thing that's clear to me is that cultural identity will be the core of all our important dialogues going forward. We need to address quality of life for First Nations in New Brunswick. We need to close the gap, build capacity, so that First Nations can reach self-determination, self-sustainable governments, self-governance. We want our First Nations communities to thrive in New Brunswick, which will make all of New Brunswick thrive, which builds a better province, better country, and better relationships all around. We need to invest in education and in reviving languages, and some of that work is going on right here in New Brunswick. I'm very proud of that. We need to continue to educate Canadians on Aboriginal and treaty rights and peace and friendship treaties as they relate here in New Brunswick. And we need to work as partners to create economic well-being for everyone. Not only is this something I believe we can accomplish as a province, but it is also something I believe we must do. With respect to resource industries, I think the key is for First Nations to have a stake in the game, to be a part of the project, to be able to build capacity, to be able to have employment, a better future right here in New Brunswick. It's also important that we do this along with our First Nations and federal partners, and I want to thank Minister Bennett for being here today. I've got a chance to, she was one of the first phone calls I had as minister, and shared a great 45-minute conversation on everything from Jeremy Dutcher to what concerts we were going to attend. But it was a great conversation. I appreciate the work that she's been doing as well. I'll continue to have honest and meaningful dialogue with First Nations to advance reconciliation and to help build a stronger, more inclusive province for our children to live in. It's a time for reconciliation. It's a time for respect. It's a time for recognition of all First Nations in New Brunswick and Canada. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today. Thank you. Merci. Wilalin. Waliwan.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. J'aimerais maintenant appeler Monsieur le maire de
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I would like to call the Mayor of Fredericton, Mr. Michael O'Brien.
Mayor.
Good morning, everybody, and I'm humbled to be here today, and I'm honored on behalf of the citizens of Fredericton and the mayor, my council, to welcome you to the city of Fredericton, located in the beautiful Willistic Territory. Yesterday, Chief Polches and I raised the beautiful Willistic flag is flying proudly outside of City Hall. It's going to be there for a long time. And the National Chief, you laid out a very powerful agenda. The Assembly has many, many important issues to talk about and to address, and I wish you all the best in your deliberations. Municipalities can play a role in this as well. We're working hard with in the spirit of peace, friendship, and reconciliation with our friends, neighbors, and our partners, our increasingly important partners at St. Mary's First Nation. Recently, we combined together on the Canadian Smart Cities Challenge, and it was a full partnership between St. Mary's and the City of Fredericton. We became a national finalist. We came this close, ladies and gentlemen, this close to being a $10 million award winner. And what that was going to do was to drive a digital economy and a digital government and a digital way to connect our citizens with their communities even closer. And that was there was many programs that were going to be involved that would influence St. Mary's entrepreneurs and allow the citizens of St. Mary's to connect even closer with their government as well as the City of Fredericton. But we're going to continue on that path. We don't have the $10 million, but we have a strategy to continue moving on. And working closer and closer with the Chief and Council and people of St. Mary's to be closer economic partners. We just concluded a land deal that's, and I think the new gas bar at St. Mary's just recently opened. So that's going to help the economy of St. Mary's and the people of Fredericton. So there's a way that we can work forward even at the municipal level. So while you're here, enjoy the beautiful territory, the beautiful Woolastook River, the trails that run along it and past St. Mary's, and our vibrant downtown and our green parks and the natural gifts that we have here to offer. Have fun in the City of Fredericton. Enjoy yourself. Get out to the shops. Tell them Mayor Mike sent you. And have some great deliberations and enjoy the social parts. Take the memories of St. Mary's First Nation, the Woolastook Territory, and the City of Fredericton back with you across Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mayor Mike, and let him know that Chair Tarbell said that there was a 10% discount at every. I'm sure that'll be very valuable. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Let us turn to the Tri-Council update. So we are joined by, speaking on behalf of the Elders Council, Elder Mike Mitchell, who of course many of us remember from his long tenure as the Grand Chief for Akwesasne, and just making his way to the podium. Just as he's making his way, just as a reminder, we are working through our council updates, Women's Council up next, and then the new Youth Council chairs, the male and female chairs, and then we will adopt the rules agenda, do the audited financial statement information, and that should get us to the lunch. And then we'll, after lunch, be joined by Honorable Minister Carolyn Bennett, and then begin our programming, and we'll adjust as we need to. So with that, please help me welcome Elder Mike Mitchell.
Now, Sego, I'm going to start by singing you a song. I don't want nobody standing up. I'm just going to share a song with you. It's a grandmother's song. And when I was a small boy, I lived with my grandparents. They would have a farm, had about 30 head of cattle, and worked every day, 5 o'clock to 10 o'clock at night. And when my grandmother collected eggs, worked in her garden, hung clothes out, she had this little song, and she used one word, one Mohawk word, Yuhahio, which means it is a good road. Yuhahio giwahe. It is a good road going in forward or in the future. I won't do it justice because it's a woman's song, kind of like a lullaby. So I'm going to give you a short version of it. Yo-hi-yo, 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 yo-hi-yo. Yo-hi-yo, yo-hi-yo. Yo-hi-yo, yo-hi-yo. Yo-hi-yo, yo-hi-yo. Yo-hi-yo, yo-hi-yo. Now you can try to imagine a woman hanging clothes in a clothesline and doing her chores, singing a song. That was my impression of living with grandparents who taught you culture and language. And my grandfather always believed that language was his sovereignty. And so yesterday's meeting, I repeated that. Language, indigenous language, is your sovereignty. It defines you, your identity, your culture, and your nationhood. So all the work that has been done on language, I'm really appreciative, which leads me to the group that I have been working with. The man that has the portfolio for elders is from Northwest Territories. His name is Norman Yakulele. He couldn't make it down. He's probably in flight somewhere, but I heard he wasn't feeling well, so he got a late start and asked if I would read his message and his report to you. Since the inception of the National Indian Brotherhood and the transition to the Assembly of First Nations, there's always been a place of honor and distinction for elders that is evident with the Charter of the Assembly of First Nations. The AFN Council of Elders provided both spiritual and political guidance in the formation of the organization, its structures, and its charter. The Council helped shape the AFN policies, relationship with federal government and other national and international organizations. During the past 37 years, the AFN's leadership has relied on the historical and cultural knowledge of Council, especially on matters pertaining to treaty rights and First Nations governance. This role continues today. The Council includes representatives of each of the AFN's 10 regions. The Council continues to play an important part in all facets of AFN and its operations. Council continues to meet biannually at AFN General Assemblies and AFN Special Chiefs Assemblies to discuss issues and challenges facing the Council and bringing together new ideas. One may wonder what the elders can add to a political organization. Well, in my short time sitting with them, they offer inspiration, stories, culture, language, political history, and it reinforces our very being of being Ogwehunwe. So at this time, I would like to ask the Elders Council to stand, be introduced to the Assembly. These are people that come from all across Canada, amongst the different nations. They live among us. It is their experience that we will benefit from. It is their experience and know-how that will guide us in our path to self-determination, self-government. There is nothing more stronger than the assistance and the direction and support from our elders. So the AFN Council of Elders, sit with us, counsel us. The Council has made efforts to engage with other elders in their regions to share information, to communicate national messages to the grassroots. Council participated in a 3-day retreat in June to focus on development of a terms of reference. It's a work in progress. It is our new path forward, the role that they will play in. So I've been asked to give a short introduction on the ongoing work of the Elders that works with the Assembly of First Nation. Thank you. Yahweh.
Thank you, Elder Mitchell. I would now like to call up Regional Chief Roseanne Archibald to be doing introduction remarks for the Women's Council.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very happy to be here with you, Roseanne Archibald, Natishnakas, and Dagotagonishkatel Kochian. Monishkakoiskashkitan Gichinoyan, Sagoshmagan, Kitsunamas, and Gichitainimoyan. And I, first of all, want to say Gichimigwash Ninanaskamun to the people of this area, the Woolstick, for hosting us on their territory, acknowledging the Peace and Friendship Treaty, and I'm very happy to be with you today. I do want to introduce the Women's Council. I'm not sure where they're sitting. They might be dispersed throughout the room, but if, is Chief Connie Big Eagle in here? Oh, there. I'd like to actually, we have two coming up. So the first is Denise Stonefish, who is the former chair of the Women's Council, and she is just finishing her term on the council, and joining her is Chief Connie Big Eagle, who is the incoming chair for the Women's Council, and I'll allow them to maybe point out some of the other members that are with us today. The work they do for us is invaluable. They guide us, they provide us with direction, they give us that perspective that we need when it comes to looking at our issues through a gender lens, acknowledging the important views of women. Miigwech.
Quinganao Loemwa. Nita Shinzi, Denise Stonefish, Noan Giaye, Al Napawi La Kawit. I take this opportunity to acknowledge Wolfstock Nation and acknowledge the elder and the drum this morning. As Regional Chief Archibald has indicated, the Assembly of First Nations Council represents AFN by affirming the importance of building and strengthening partnerships between men and women in all levels of decision-making within the AFN. This is an integral step in achieving an equitable society. The Women's Council is comprised of one or more females in leadership positions representing each of the 10 regions. We have a clear vision of how it can contribute to the equitable society of First Nations through more immediate goals of economic empowerment, innovation in building cultural capacity, healing for families and communities of missing and murdered Indigenous persons, keeping families together, and the First Nations citizenship and the long-term vision of improved First Nations quality of life. The AFN Women's Council is at a critical point in time where key actions must be undertaken to fully exercise its mandate and role within the AFN as a recognized principal organ and as an important mechanism for First Nations women's voices to be brought forward. Since the annual General Assembly in July 2018, members of the Women's Council have been engaged in various meetings and activities. Representatives have attended various gatherings, forums, and have attended meetings regarding safety and security of Indigenous women and girls and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The Women's Council also participated in the federal and provincial territorial meetings of the Ministers of Status of Women held in 2018. This marked the second time that the ministers of the status of women have invited the Women's Council to participate in these meetings and has provided an excellent opportunity for the Council to discuss its priorities and explore building partnerships. In addition, the AFN Women's Council also participated in the third North American Trilateral Working Group on Violence against Indigenous Women and Girls held in October 2018 in Mexico City. So under our economic and empowerment and innovation, First Nations represent an important human resource pool for economic empowerment and sustainability and for growth of industries in the broader Canadian society. First Nations women are in need of increased employment and training opportunities in the industry and fair and equitable opportunities for employment in this area, particularly for women in non-traditional industries. We need to look at innovative ways to build the on-reserve economy, and it must be explored to promote personal financial independence and to sustain communities and the environment. It is a goal of the AFN Women's Council to create or to help create economic opportunities through establishing partnerships, developing tools and resources, and undertaking research. To this end, the Women's Council has secured funding from the Women and Gender Equality Canada to further enhance capacity to develop these much-needed economic partnerships, tools, and resources. And the Women's Council looks forward to engaging First Nations women in various regions to further this important work. Now, under the National Inquiry to Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, as we all know, the report was released on June 3rd, 2019. The report, this final report, explores many intersectional issues which contribute to the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The final report also contains 4 overarching findings related to rights recognition, justice, security, health and wellness, and includes 231 calls for action on justice, which included recommendations to governments, including Indigenous governments, institutions, industries, service providers, partners, and to all Canadians. More than 2,380 people participated in the National Inquiry's hearings. 468 families and members and survivors of violence have shared their experiences and recommendations at 15 community hearings. Over 270 family members and survivors shared their stories in 147 private or in-camera sessions. Almost 750 people shared evidence through statement gathering, and 819 people created artistic expressions to become part of the National Inquiry's legacy archive. Another 83 expert witnesses, elders and knowledge keepers, frontline workers, and officials provided testimony in 900 institutional and expert and knowledge keeper hearings. The final report contains several important recommendations which impact directly upon First Nations women and girls and the 2S LGBTQIA. The calls to justice include recommendations with regard to patterns of systemic racial and gender human rights and Indigenous rights violations and abuses, failures to uphold and protect the Indigenous and human rights of all Indigenous women and girls and the 2S LGBTQIA people, the displacement of Indigenous women from their traditional roles and recognition of self-determination and self-governance as fundamental Indigenous and human rights and as a best practice. The Women's Council has conducted meetings to specifically review the National Inquiry's final report findings and the calls to justice. We understand that the Crown Indigenous Relations Canada will be conducting roundtable engagement on the development of a national action plan. However, the AFN Women's Council believes and has consistently advocated for immediate action to ensure the safety and security of Indigenous women and girls. And I think that you can see and realize that the number of work that has went into by our families and our survivors, that we cannot let the 231 recommendations just stand there and say, this is it. So we need to put forward action and implement those actions. To this end, the Women's Council will be putting forward its recommendations for immediate action on the final report's call for justice, as well as longer-term priorities. The AFN firmly stands behind the survivors and the family members in their fight for justice for their loved ones. The AFN has been here to support the families and survivors and to advocate changes to the laws and policies of this country which suppress and ignore the rights of First Nations women and girls. Women have always been at the heart of our nations, and it is time for their rights to be recognized and respected by all Canadians. So it is essential that governments and institutions and service providers recognize and address institutional racism and the many barriers to the safety and security of First Nations women and girls and the LGBTQ2S. So that concludes the Women's Council report, but I also would like to take the opportunity to, as Chief Archibald has mentioned, that this is the conclusion of my term as the chair of the Women's Council. And it has been an honor and a privilege to represent the women, my fellow colleagues at the council level, and it's been an honor and a privilege to represent all First Nations women. So, and a she, yeah, and a she. And I'd like to thank my own community, my Lenape Nation, and the citizens of my First Nation for allowing me the opportunity to be here. I take this opportunity to introduce the new chair that has been selected by the Women's Council. Please welcome Chief Connie Bigigle from the Saskatchewan region.
Good morning, everyone. I ran against Chief Stonefish, and it was a tough election, but I kicked her butt. No, we're all sorry to see her go, and we don't quite understand why that's happening. But I want to acknowledge all the good work that she did as our chair and the chairs before her. And I have some big moccasins to fill, and one of the things that we're going to be asking for is more funding from AFN so that we can run a proper table. So thank you. And I acknowledge my peers for giving me this honor. Thank you.
And Chief Bigigle will have the assistance of Chief Adrienne Jerome from the Quebec region as her vice chair.
Merci au Conseil des femmes.
Thank you to the Women's Council for this. So we are now with
Report. Et j'invite maintenant la chef régionale Clouan Adam.
So I will invite Clun Adamek for a few preliminary remarks.
Merci, en français, c'est beau.
So in French, that's beautiful.
Chair, and of course, an honor to provide brief opening remarks in welcome of our two new AFN National Youth Council co-chairs. If I could ask the National Youth Council to just stand for a moment, I think that would be most appropriate. So these are the young people. If you would join me in providing a strong round of applause, an acknowledgement. There are, thank you so much. These are emerging leaders from across the country. Each region, of course, has a male and female representative, ensuring that we have gender balance and gender equity in all parts of those conversations. But certainly, we welcome the two co-chairs as members of the National Executive. Really pleased to have had the opportunity to join the Youth Council on Sunday to listen and learn and understand the priorities of young people from across the country, from coast to coast to coast. And certainly, the Youth Council's deliberations with respect to climate action, the responsibility of women and the responsibility of men to stand with and to support women. And of course, we all here in our communities, nothing for us without us. And so when we do our work, it's so important that we ensure that our emerging leaders are part of all conversations in our communities, regionally, nationally. And so without further ado, want to welcome the two new co-chairs, Rosalie from the Eastern Door, and of course, Roland from Saskatchewan region to the podium to provide their remarks. So thank you again, and so pleased to be working with all of you. Gynnoch Chish.
Tanse. Nasiga sunagumawa tiknapel. Sastunotinia. Apsis pugo nehewan. I'm still learning. Each word I learn, I seem to find myself. I'm in university. Every paper I write, everything I engage in, I always consult with an elder. Why? Because it is time we start acknowledging that we have PhD equivalent knowledge in our world. So I'd like to take this time to acknowledge the Elders Council. Without your stories, without your language, your experience through life, it would be a lot harder to find who I am. So thank you.
Gwe nogama Paxipi Walalo Pandalbe Dayok, Ukjilirak, Begamok Sultiok, Walalangus Uchtandeli Gameweg a big dick Nagweg, Edwaktamadi, Gukchik Melgi Nordic to Dandeli and Kadasulti, Indelusi, Rosie Labilwa, Akinchajak Mish Delusi, Wabeg Missibiriaj, Edeligan, Ohodnak Edeliganai, Akindodam, Nagunik, Ingiguk, na Gordon, Aklenda, Labilwa, Delewi, Gespegawagi. My name is Rosalie Labilwa, and I am the New Brunswick and PEI female representative, and as well as the newly elected co-chair for the AFN National Youth Council. I would like to, welcome everybody here, and it's very nice to see you guys again in our region, in the homeland of the Willow Stick Way, and to acknowledge your land that we're here today on. My parents, my mother is Glenda Wiseout Labilwa from Listigish, Quebec, and my father is Gordon Labilwa from Ilverbar First Nation, and I come from District 7 in Mi'kmaq Territory. On the behalf of the AFN National Youth Council, we want to thank AFN for allowing time on the agenda to provide this assembly with an update on the work that we have been doing for the past couple of months. I really would love to acknowledge our portfolio holders, Regional Chief Adamick and Regional Chief Picard. You know, we hold you up for all your hard work and dedication you do for the youth portfolio. As the AFN National Youth Council, our mission is to establish greater visibility and inclusion for our most vulnerable and most important part of our nations, our young people. We are committed to defend with integrity and to support with dedication and to advocate for the Indigenous youth to our best abilities. This year marks the AFN's 40th AGA anniversary, and we want to also acknowledge that it's the 20th anniversary for the AFN National Youth Council as well. To honor this year's AGA theme, celebrating success and giving thanks, we want to celebrate with some past AFN National Youth Council alumni. For many of the Youth Council has provided members with opportunities for leadership and to speak to the significance of empowering emerging leaders. Some of the past alumni we would like to mention are the AFN Yukon Regional Chief Kuani Adamek, you know, for your time, and also as well as Jaime Batiste from Eskasoni, who is now the Treaty Commissioner of Nova Scotia and newly nominated Liberal MP candidate for his riding. As well as Caitlin Tolley from Kitigan-Zibi, who is newly called to the bar as a lawyer, and Sasha Miracle, who spent 10 years on the AFN Youth Council and was a former co-chair, as well as Stephanie Sidney from the Tlingit Council, who is now one of the founders and one of the first AFN National Youth Council representatives. And as well as somebody who's near and dear to my heart, one of my cousin, Jasmine Labilwa, who is also a former co-chair from Ilverbar First Nation, who is currently in her master's program from the University of Saskatchewan in land-based education. And Tim Catchaway, one of the AGA meeting co-chairs. We strive to advise the AFN through advocacy and working with all levels of leadership. One of our main priorities is advocating for the protection of our lands, waters, and all living creatures. Indigenous youth, such as Adam Pelche, have stood with integrity in very similar spaces such as these and advocated for the protection of our waters, and we hold her up.
As a result of our ongoing commitment to environmental advocacy, we hosted a National Youth Summit on environment, on climate action in April of this year. We, alongside of well over 80 participants from around Canada, have come up and developed recommendations on climate action that we will share here today. So I'll list them off now. Decolonize and reconnect to all living entities, such as land, waters, non-human beings, medicines, and spirits. 2, ensure lands, waters, non-human beings, medicines, and sacred sites are protected and accessible now and for 7 generations to come. Support 3, support youth in developing sustainable green infrastructure and transportation solutions in their First Nations. 4, prioritize community well-being over profit. 5, practice sustainable consumption. 6, support youth in developing education and training for creating scalable, local, and land-based solutions. In addition to this work, we are eager to participate in the AFN Chiefs Committee meetings to continue to share not only our voices, but the youth of Canada's voices. As a council, we look forward to building our relationship with the AFN Executive Committee by being a part of discussion around the AFN Charter renewal. Excuse my crease coming out. As emerging leaders, we recognize the deep importance to be a part of leading the way into a sustainable future. Thank you. Tenege.
Thank you so much for that acknowledgement, co-chairs of the National Youth Council. There's one individual that was left off the list, and I'd like to acknowledge him. I know he is here. He was a member of the National Youth Council. He is now the Grand Chief of the Southern Chiefs organization in Manitoba. Mr. Grand Chief Jerry Daniels served as a Manitoba rep on the National Youth Council a few years ago. So I'd like to acknowledge that. Harold?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to announce that we are, in fact, 15 minutes ahead of schedule. You got to celebrate. It says celebrate successes. So. All right, we turn now to the adoption of the agenda. I understand that I have Chief Dan George from Burns Lake, BC, moving the agenda, and Chief Elaine Johnson from Serpent River, Ontario, seconding the adoption of the agenda and the rules which you have in front of you. There are 16 topics over the next 2.5 days. We also have 3 federal ministers and 3 federal party representatives. And we also will do some honorings and some rememberings as we go through the schedule. And so with that, the agenda in front of you, is there any need for discussion? Having been moved and seconded, oh, Chief Fox?
My traditional name is Makinima, and I say hello to all of you today. We have had some concerns with the processes that AFN have engaged in the last little while with regard to blocking the initiatives that we have undertaken in order to fulfill financial sovereignty to some degree. The more financial sovereignty that a nation has, the better home rule that nation will have, and it's been proven in North America over the last few decades. However, there are times when the national organization imposes certain restrictions on member nations as far as participation in key initiatives are concerned. An example is the process that was set in motion with respect to the to Bill C-69 and the process that AFN engaged in. They forgot one part of the representation, and that aspect of representation dealt with those of us who have engaged in oil and natural gas exploration and production and transmission over the past few decades. And Bill C-69 really, put us in a crunch. I can talk about all the different ways that it put us in a crunch, but let me just give you a quick example. And that example is last August, we're earning about $610,000 per month from our oil, just from our oil royalties. And when these bills start coming about, Bill C-69, Bill C-49, it made our oil royalties less, so that in January we merely got $120,000. It's an example of how federal legislation can impact negatively to some of us. Yes, we are concerned about protecting our lands, our water, our people, our animals, the birds. We are very concerned. We've been doing it for over 7 decades. Not once have we ever harmed anybody, any animal, our water, our lands, the air, and so on. However, Bill C-69 imposed restrictions whereby it lowered the value of our natural resources. And those are some of the proceeds that we use to help our elders, our youth, cultural activities, and so on. So I'm just hoping that at some time there will be some discussion on how everyone who has something at stake on a given matter, a given situation, is asked to participate. We were left out, totally left out. We weren't even informed or invited to any of the sessions that you had. We had to impose ourselves at the meeting in Calgary. And so it's very unfortunate that it seemed as though, at least in that one matter, that AFN was following the tune of the Liberal government. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. I just want to acknowledge the comments. I will note to the delegation that in terms of the agenda, we do have this afternoon federal legislation, implementation, and impact. So that would be the opportunity to re-engage in the conversation on Bill C-69. So it is, in effect, covered by our current agenda. Seeing no further discussion on the agenda, let us call the question. Is there any opposition to the adoption of the agenda and the rules? Seeing none, is there any abstentions? Seeing none, then with your permission, we adopt the rules and the agenda by consensus. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. I look to our next presenters, Ruth Jackson and Keith Martell. Going to be doing financial updates. I see the auditor from Deloitte joining. So, Ruth.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, elders, chiefs, delegates, and guests. I am presenting the financial statements for the National Indian Brotherhood Secretariat, Assembly of First Nations, for fiscal year March 31st, 2019. The audited financial statements have been approved by the Board of Directors on Sunday, July 21st. We're providing it here to you for information purposes. You will find the financial statements within the AFN annual report. The English version on page 126 and the French on page 147. I'll now refer to page numbers within the financial statement section. After the cover page and the table of contents, you'll find the independent audit report. The report will be presented by Anne-Marie Etier, partner with Deloitte, following my presentation. On page 3, you'll find the statement of operations. The total revenue for fiscal year 2019 is at $41.8 million. Expenses at approximately $40.5 million. Next slide. Comparative figures from 2018 show revenue at a total increase of $9.8 million. The increase in 2019 relates mainly to Indigenous Services Canada and Crown Indigenous Relations. I'll further refer to them as ISC and CERNA. Another main area of increase is Health Canada. For the ISC and CERNA increases, they're due mainly to enhanced regional work across all province and territories relating to work through requested through resolutions from Chiefs in Assembly. Approximately $3.5 million is from flow-throughs. The increase to Health Canada is relating to work stemming from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling. Some of the other changes include housing, water, operations, and maintenance, in line with resolutions from 2017-2018, support for review of safe drinking water legislation, and resolutions for support of review of Canada's operation and maintenance data policy. Health Canada increased by $2 million relates to funding flow-through for First Nation Child and Family Services reform, includes work conducting research towards new funding model, and the work is in line with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling and work in collaboration with First Nation child welfare across Canada while meeting the National Advisory Committee's recommendations. Other areas of work that maintained funding levels from 2018 to 2019, education, support and implementation of First Nation control of First Nation education, and is regionally led, and implementing First Nation post-secondary policy proposals approved by Chiefs in Assembly. Climate change includes $1 million of funding flow through to regions and funding for regional climate change coordinator. Social assistance relating to working groups within each region and consultation with First Nation in relation to implementation of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal order and Jordan's Principle and child welfare, as well as support for the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society. Canadian Heritage funded $1.7 million. Comparative figure from 2018 is showing 0. Funding was flowed through INAC last fiscal year. Privy Council Office provided approximately $250,000 for participation in the inquiry hearing for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. All other funding with some increases: Employment and Social Development Canada at $200,000, Fisheries and Oceans $200,000, Environment and Climate Change Canada $340,000, Public Health Agency of Canada $453,000, Public Safety of Canada $200,000. Funding for all other departments increased by $1 million. The main activities related to own source revenue at AFN, AFN Store, selling promotional items, registration, AGA, SCA trade show, Gulf Christmas Gala, along with some sponsorships and smaller contracts. Next slide, on to expenses. Expenses in 2019 were in line with the funding increase areas. Total expenses at $40.5 million. Some of the changes included regional service delivery, funding flow through for administration of regional offices, increase of $356,000. Professional fees, including legal, translation, and contracts, increase to legal related to AFN's engagement in litigation at various levels. Some include murdered and missing Indigenous women inquiries, carbon tax reference, BC Environment Protection Plan. AFN was also engaged in implementation of Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in various jurisdictions. Other tribunal cases, Jordan's Principle and child welfare. As per contracts, the main increase was the housing sector for water and maintenance and operations, and agreements with all 10 regions. Increases to salaries, rent, and travel was in line with the additional projects. Total surplus for fiscal 2019 is at $1.39 million. Management has met expected outcomes in the past 2 years in relation to accumulating the surpluses in order to cover future costs relating to reorganization, including AFN charter renewal. Surpluses come from AFN own source revenue. Next slide, on to page 4. You'll find the statement of financial position. Major changes: cash balance of $12.2 million. This relates to agreements signed late in the year, February and March, and funds received prior to year end with expenses paid in the next fiscal year. Some also relate to deferred revenue for projects to the regions for the housing, O&M, and data collection, which regions asked to have the projects deferred to the new fiscal period. The grants and contributions receivable increased to approximately 3.7 from 1.8. Also, some late arrival of agreements and due to holdbacks. You'll find further breakdown in Note 4, page 9. Prepaid expenses increased by $330,000. Majority of this relates to prepayment for National Mental Wellness Forum that was held April 1st and 2nd in the new fiscal period. Next slide, on to liabilities. Some major changes. Accounts payable and accrued liabilities increase of $1.5 million from last fiscal. AFN held many meetings in the last quarter. Education forum, housing, social, and payments made in the new fiscal period. Deferred contributions increased to $7.9 million in 2019, as agreements were allowed to be deferred to the new fiscal period. You will find a list of deferred contributions in Note 6 on page 10. The main funding agency was ISK, and it related mainly to the water housing projects. Excess contribution increased by $60,000 relating to ISK project as well. You'll find a further notes in Note 7, page 10 of the English, and page 11 in French. So the organization has an accumulated net surplus of $1.4 million at March 31st, and management is implementing a plan to ensure AFN's own source revenue generates sufficient funds to pay for restructuring of AFN and charter renewal. I've provided the major changes to the numbers from 2018 to 2019 with the projects. The other statements, notes, and schedules will provide further details to the numbers I've just gone over. I'll now pass it on to Anne-Marie Etier, partner with Deloitte.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Elders, national chief, regional chiefs, and distinguished guests, bonjour, good morning, miigwech. My name is Anne-Marie Etier. I'm from Kitigan-Zibi First Nation, and I'm an audit partner at Deloitte. Deloitte performed the audit of the financial statements of the AFN as of March 31st, 2019. On July 21st, 2019, we have met with the executive of the AFN to discuss the scope of our audit and the results of our audit. In accordance with Canadian auditing standards, our audit is designed to enable us to express an opinion on the fairness of the presentation of AFN's annual financial statement prepared in accordance with Canadian accounting standards for not-for-profit organizations. No restrictions have been placed on the scope of our audit. In performing the audit, we were giving full and complete access to the accounting records, supporting documentation, and any other information we requested. I also confirmed that we are independent, and we were independent all year long of AFN. As the financial statements were approved on July 21st by the executive, we have issued an unmodified audit report on the financial statements of AFN for the year ended March 31st, 2019. Thank you very much, and have a good meeting.
Thank you very much, AFN. I would now like to introduce the chairman of the National Indian Brotherhood Trust Fund, Mr. Keith Martell.
Thank you, Tim. So as Tim mentioned, I'm the chair of the Board of Trustees of the National Indian Brotherhood Trust Fund, and part of our obligation is to present annually the financial results of NIB. My day job, I'm the CEO of First Nations Bank of Canada, and as I mentioned, I do volunteer for this position to lead the NIB on behalf of the beneficiaries from your communities and across the country. I wanted to begin by just doing a quick reminder of what NIB is. For those of you who may not remember, the organization goes back some time. It was formed in 1975 as a National Indian Brotherhood Trust Fund, and it was established as a trust and a registered charity. If you remember, in 2009, the articles were amended in order to prepare the trust to provide funding to educational programs and reconciliation initiatives to address the legacy of the Indian residential schools. And that was in preparation for the 2015-16 transfer of the residual funds from the designated amount fund from the Indian residential school settlement to the NIB Trust Fund for administration and delivery of support for programs in communities, to individuals, and to groups across the country. Today, the NIB Trust Fund administers a number of funds to carry out the objects and objects of the trust and the charity. Our full audited financial statements are on the website www.nibtrust.ca, and I'm here today to present you an overview of the financial results for fiscal 2018-19. Our most important and primary activity of the Trust is the funding of programs aimed at healing, reconciliation, and knowledge building. In 2018-19, we funded both groups and individuals, and we have found, as we've found in every year since NIB began this process, that there's always more demand than we can fund. In 2018-19, for groups and organizations, we received 168 applications requesting $23 million. The fund was able to fund 87 of those projects and deliver $7.2 million to support those programs, which impacted many individuals across the country. As for individual funding, this is primarily for scholarships and bursaries and support for training and individual development and growth. There was 1,619 applications in the last fiscal year requesting $12.5 million, and we were able to support $2.1 million to 840 individuals across the country. Some highlights of our financial results for the year ended March 31st, 2019. As at March 31, 2019, the total fund balances, which I'll detail in a minute, were $203.59 million, which included the Education Legacy Fund for $106 million, the Education Fund for $92.7 million, the Métis Fund for $3.94 million. We often get questions as to why we administer the Métis Fund. The RRS terms allowed for an allocation to the Métis, of which we are responsible for allocating and delivering to Métis funds, or to Métis groups and individuals across Canada, and it is managed as well by the NIB Trust. There's also about $50,000 of other funds, which are really the residual funds from the early days of NIB, which we continue to oversee. We had investment income for the year ended March 31, 2019 of $9.23 million. We invest primarily during that fiscal year in 2 balanced fund managers, but we have recently reallocated those funds, recognizing the long-term interest of the beneficiaries to maximize the return and to protect the assets to deliver the continued support of individuals and groups across the country. And we just recently enacted that transfer to 4 new asset managers specializing in various parts of the market, and we anticipate that change will enhance our capacity to be sustainable as a fund. We distributed to beneficiaries in the fiscal year ended March 31, $10.1 million, including $9.4 million from the Education Fund. Those were all geared to First Nations individuals and groups, and $0.74 million to the Métis organizations. Our administration expenses for operating the NIB Fund, which includes qualifying individuals and groups, following up on the results of those fundings, and continuing to support the beneficiaries through the process, was a total of 12.23% of the total amounts delivered to beneficiaries. The trust agreement allows for up to 15% allocation for administration expenses, so we were below budget in our administration expenses for the fund. The funds, as I mentioned, include the 3 funds, primarily the Education Fund, the Education Legacy Fund, and the Métis Fund. And as I mentioned, at the end of the year, they had in total $203.59 million. We started the year, as you can see from this table, with a total funds of $144.6 million. During the year, to summarize the activity, we had further contributions from the Government of Canada of $61.17 million. We had investment income of $9.23 million, as I mentioned. We had distributions to groups and individuals, both for the projects I mentioned for last fiscal year, plus for some funding for projects that have been approved in prior years. The total of that funding and distribution to groups and individuals was a little over 10 million, and we had expenses of net 1.24 after the recovery of some interest expense. The transfer from the Government of Canada was the second transfer from the Indian Residential School funds under the RRSSA, and it may be the last transfer of capital to this fund, although there is some residual funds which are still outstanding for claims which may still come to the NIB fund. Most importantly, I think, is where this money went. And if you look at the groups and organizations that our organization funded during fiscal 18 and 19, it included support in groups for culture, education, employment, youth, language, family reconciliation, healing reconciliation, and scholarships. These are all in line with the mandate of NIB and are supportive of many, these groups and organizations touch many individuals, families, and community members across the country. And in the individual side, 21% of our 840 approved applications were to direct residential school students, former students, and 72% were to intergenerational survivors. The other 7% would be to status Indian individuals, but their status as residential school students, former students, or survivors would be either unknown or undeclared. In closing, I'd like to thank my fellow Board of Trustees for their hard work and support. This is a very hard-working board in both managing the funds, overseeing the trust funds to protect them for future distributions, but also supporting staff and ensuring that the distributions to worthy projects and individuals across the country meets the mandate of NIB. We had 3 trustees who left the trust board this year, and I'd like to specifically thank them. Bertha Rabiska-Zoe was replaced as a trustee in May of this year, just recently, and has now left the board. And we had 2 trustees whose term expired in the year and who served on for many years, and their term limit hit in 2018-19. They left the board in December of 2018. That would include my beardless friend, Tim Catchaway, and Daniel Nolette from Quebec, who both left the board and this year, but were there right from the beginning and served with great honor and dignity and knowledge. So we'd like to thank them for that. In closing, I would just like to encourage all members of communities and leadership to speak to your regional trustee and speak to our NIB staff to learn more about NIB and how we can help your communities and your individuals in your communities get access to the kind of supports that NIB provides. Thank you for your attention this morning.
I think he meant to say fearless friend, not beardless friend. I looked to my co-chair, Harold. You're going to be coming and doing the next portion of the... Is there any questions from the floor on the audit statements that were presented? Again, these were for information only. There was a change to the law around the CRA where these pieces no longer need to be approved from the floor. So I looked at microphone number 2.
Bonjour. Chief Mel Harley, Biswabik Zaganishnabek, as Rockaby First Nation in Ontario. Bonjour, Grand, our national chief, and all you regional chiefs. Say Jimmy Guesh for the land that we're meeting on. This is my old territory there, so you know, Grand Chiefs. I was served in the military in Gagetown. This is my old stomping grounds. No, I was just wondering, I was looking at your, you know, really the funds have really bloomed within the last year, okay, which is great. I think it should be a pat on the back for that, but I'm just looking at some of the balloons in certain areas. Like I know, not much, probably for 100 grand in the difference in the expenses, but the professional fees has gone up 4 million. I'm sure you have examples of that. But I guess the bigger thing for me is the fact that, you know, you're getting all this money coming in, and we're looking at the capability or the advocacy of from your office coming to the chief's office with regard to expenditure. You know what I mean? And I'm sure that And I was just briefing all your notes now. I was able to open up my computer finally, catching up fast. The other thing was missing, and I don't know if you do this as a matter of factly, but the management letter, was there any issues with regard to management within that? I mean, that's just some basic questions that somebody would ask. Because I figured I've been around for a while, I'll be around for the next 3.5 years anyway, so I kind of want to get to know what's going on. Miigwech.
Thank you. Who wants to?
Just the management letter. There was no management recommendation this year to do. So there was no issues. Yeah.
Hello?
Microphone 2.
Well, again. Yes, I just want to know if that could be provided.
Yeah.
If you could provide that, that'd be great. Miigwech.
Thank you, Chief. Any other questions, comments? Chief, microphone 2.
Thank you for the good reports that have been made both with the NIB Trust and AFN proper. On the AFN funding, there was mention of flow-throughs, Ruth. Those flow-throughs, do they actually go to the member nations or their organizations, or how does that process work? Thank you.
There were several flow-throughs. There's the regional chief office, so 10 in 10 different regions flowed through to run their offices of approximately 350,000 each. And there was also flow-through for work on the child welfare case. So it was another organization that flow-through of $2 million from Health Canada. They asked AFN to flow the funds through so that the work can be conducted for child welfare.
Thank you very much. Seeing no other questions or comments from the floor, I would like to thank the presenters for presenting the material. Thank you very much. Turn it over to my co-chair.
Thank you very much for that. As we move into the final discussion this morning, Chief Wilson, you had asked for permission to speak. Microphone 2, please.
I first of all want to thank the people of the land here, the Wistokwe, for allowing us to do business today in the beautiful pipe ceremony and the canoe journey this morning, and the ones that participated in the ceremony. I just wanted to acknowledge the different opening remarks from National Chief and the Regional Chief, and also the Elders and Youth and Women's Council. I just wanted to comment that I didn't feel I heard enough about the calls for justice. I did mention that to our Regional Chief, Terry TG, and I really feel that it's been underscored here. National Chief, I want to especially say that this is a foremost issue with our women still missing and murdered. In our province of BC, we have a search by Marlene Jack and her family, and Regional Chief's aware of that. They supported that, and the Union BC Chief supports that. And they're going out this week to search for Marlene's sister, who's been missing for 30 years. In my own territory, in Salmon Arm area, in one of our sacred mountains, we have a search going on. So I want to appeal to all of the regional chiefs, the national chief, and even the premiers and any of the MLAs, that we have to be able to say calls for justice has to be implemented. Trudeau to date, nor any of the premiers of the province have took up that, enacting that national action plan. And we need to be able to press forward to say that needs to be done in justice for our women. And also that it be an Indigenous women-led process in defining what that action plan is going to be. We have a resolution number 21 in the kits for consideration of the chiefs, but I want to be able to say it's not only up to Marion Buller, the Chief Justice Commissioner, who did all of that work with her other commissioners. It's up to all of us to be able to implement the justice, the calls to justice. It's really important we do that. And I want to say that because, you know, we're here all in an assembly of chiefs and leaderships from all across Canada. We have to be able to say, in Canada, there has been genocide. We have to be able to say it, and we have to be able to understand it, to be able to work towards reconciliation. We shouldn't be able to be afraid to say that. Trudeau couldn't say that at the National Inquiry ceremony. The only one I heard was Premier Horgan was able to say that in his statement. But we have to be able to say and turn around how our women are being treated, our Indigenous women and girls are being treated in Canada, and also be able to say it starts with us, Cook's Jam.
Thank you very much, Chief. And just to note that in our agenda, we return to the final report of the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls discussion tomorrow at 10:30. I do want to call on Grand Chief Brian Hardlot from Treaty 6, and he'll be joined by Montreal Lake Cree Nation Chief Frank Roberts, the Elder Stephen Ross, and the Councillor Eldon Henderson. They've requested the permission as a matter of protocol to present the Treaty 6 flag for posting. Yeah. And we have one other as well that will come to following Treaty 6. You can come to microphone 2, I think it's. Microphone 2, please.
Good morning, and thank you for the prayers that were said this morning. And we're thankful to be in this territory as well, too. I believe it's the last territory, and we thank the Assembly for giving us an opportunity to say a few words. We brought our Woodland Cree flag with us. We're part of Woodland Cree tribe from Saskatchewan. My name is Chief Frank Roberts from Montreal Lake Cree Nation. And this year marks 130 years of commemoration of treaty signing. So we'd like to be able to have the opportunity to present our flag as well too, to fly with the other flags that are up there. And when the time comes, we'll be honored to have that opportunity. So thank you for allowing us to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Grand Chief. We'll ask Larry Whitelock, handles much of our AFN protocols, to get the flag from you now to get it ready for posting, and then we will bring that back when it's ready. And please let's join in thanking the Chief, Grand Chief, and the chiefs from Montreal Lake. I want to call on Chief Ralph Leon from St'Alis First Nation in British Columbia, also wishes to speak to the flag for their First Nation. Microphone 1.
Titalapsit siam, Sauktalsqui, Talitzel Quas St'Alis. Aetis Gwalwell Quilt Quitlala Titalapsit. Sil Ali, our councilman, Kelty Charlie, and myself, Chief Ralph Leon. We stand here humbly and gracefully and proud because we're beside the river here, and at home we're the river people also. So it makes me feel good, makes me feel proud to ask that our flag stand with all the rest of the flags of all of our brothers and sisters throughout Indian country. It'll be proud for our tribe to have our flag up there with the rest of us. You know, we're Latsamat. We're a one people. We can't lose the insight of why we're here, working together, regardless, where a one people should be standing together on everything that we do. We're stronger together as a people, as brothers and sisters. So with that, I thank our national chief, all the regional chiefs and the staff, and all the chiefs that are here, and the council members and all your staff, ACM.
Thank you very much. Larry Whitetuck, if you would, please. So arrangements will be made to do some official posting later today when that can be done. I do want to note and turn to a brief information item from AFOA Canada, which, as many of you will recall, was sponsored by the AFN, and has often their CEO and President, Terry Goodtrack, would always come in giving a rousing speech. They've sent a brief video they've asked that we show to you. If we could show that video, please.
Every First Nation across Canada has an economic and social vision for their community. To achieve this vision, community leaders need to invest in their human capital by further developing the skills and knowledge of their staff. At AFOA Canada, we can support your community's vision with the training we offer in management, finance, and governance. AFOA Canada has partnered with the Harvard Business School to create the Leading People and Investing to Build Sustainable Communities program. Each year, a cohort of Indigenous leaders and professionals attend the 4-day program at the prestigious Harvard University to study investment governance, entrepreneurial finance, negotiations, and change management. Capacity development workshops are designed to address the key issues that Indigenous communities face. Workshops such as the Elected Leaders Series will enhance the knowledge, skills, and professional development of elected officials and their staff. We bring the workshop to you and deliver it within the community on a range of topics such as human resources, drug and alcohol policies relating to the new Cannabis Act, banking, demystifying finance for elected leaders, project management, and much more. AFOA Canada has pioneered 3 certification programs to recognize the specialized skills and knowledge of those working in Indigenous communities and organizations. The Certified Aboriginal Financial Manager, the Certified Aboriginal Professional Administrator, and the Certified Indigenous Leadership. The programs are designed by Indigenous people for Indigenous people and are offered online or in person. AFOA Canada's annual national conference is an opportunity to learn and network with people from across the country. This year's conference will be in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, October 8th to the 10th at TCU Place. The theme is Community Administration, Managing Through Disruptions, and a corporate lead sponsor is the First Nations Bank of Canada. To learn more, visit www.afoa.ca. AFOA Canada is building a community of professionals.
Thank you very much, Terry. Nicely done, as always. I've just been informed, as you may see here to my left, they are smudging the flags and the participants and posting them on the flag pole. We will ask that the drum return, and when we return at 1 o'clock, we will do a flag song to properly make that transition to posting them fully on our stage. I am also asked by the Chief of Westcrack Cree Nation to note that over the lunch break and throughout the day today, well, starting at 1 o'clock, they have a session at the Delta Hotel on the 2nd floor in the Victoria Room regarding investments and lending in the cannabis industry. So they've asked me to announce that and to invite all those of you who aren't just fully captivated by what we're doing here to attend their session. I am in the most interesting situation of being ahead of time. And so what I wanted to suggest is you will note on our agenda in the afternoon and tomorrow that we have health breaks scheduled. But as many of you will know, health breaks on an AFN agenda are a bit of a euphemism. And so, hang on 1 minute. All right, we have a choice. we have some resolutions ready. If the delegation is prepared to move to that, or we will break for lunch early. Seeing no one voting with their stomach, let us call the Resolutions Committee forward. Are you ready with the first one?
I'll do my chair.
Take mine. Or no,
Ready to go.
can you get ready on 8? As you may recall, Chiefs, the process, of course, is that it is managed through the Resolutions Committee, and we take those resolutions as they are ready and identified by the Resolutions Committee. They do try to connect them as closely to our upcoming agenda items as they can. We are asked to turn to Resolution number 8, which is called Okay. Yeah, the distribution committee has just described to us the fact that they don't have enough copies ready for distribution. There is on the USB keys. Given that, and given how the pace of our resolutions could go, I would suggest we wait until that is fully ready. And so our responsibility is to ensure that we have, informed conversations and build a consensus there. And so with that, we'll just make the decision as the chairs that we are on recess for lunch. We will return at 1 o'clock to the Minister of Crown and Indigenous Relationships, and then we will move through our agenda and pick up our resolutions this afternoon. So thank you very much. Let us enjoy these few extra minutes that we have for the lunch. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
I'll be watching you every single day, every word you say, every game you play, every night you stay. I'll be watching you, every breath you take. Oh, can't you see you belong to me? My heart aches with every step you take, every move you make, every vow you break, every smile you fake, every claim you stake. I'll be watching you. Since you're gone, I've been lost without a trace. I dream at night, I can only see your face. I look around, but it's you I can't replace. I feel so cold, I long for your embrace. I keep crying, baby, baby, please.
Starts at 1 o'clock and is at the Delta Hotel. Yeah. Or here, let me take a picture. Just to be safe. Sean, how are you?
Come say hello to you.
Yeah, well, I saw you.
Yeah, I saw you. You did a good work about I don't know if information on tape or
It's already people get
yeah, already. I was hey, look at it. I didn't see it.
Where's the furniture?
Yeah.
And then, you know, when you have to look on the view, it's immediately, what? Yeah.
Anyway, that's good.
Yeah, nice to see you again. Welcome back.